legislators would tell me how things operated around here, and that was that they didn't understand the issues of government, and they didn't have anywhere to turn when they wanted assistance. That certainly is not the way our system of government is intended to work. Why have a legislative branch of government if that's the case?
The image of the citizen legislator was long a powerful one in American culture. Chosen by friends and neighbors who knew his character, similar to them in interests and way of life, the citizen legislator would leave his regular occupation from time to time and ride to the state capitol to pass laws and, equally important, to see that the power of government was kept in check. He needed to know little more than the basic principles of government and the common wisdom of his community. Whether or not it ever corresponded to reality, this image of the citizen legislator was increasingly regarded as outmoded during the 1950s and 60s. A movement for what was called legislative modernization began in the California legislature in the early 1960s and spread through the country. It aimed to make the legislator not an amateur, but a professional supported by expert professional staff. In Connecticut, the 1965 legislature commissioned a study of itself by the Eagleton Institute of Rutgers University, which reported, "The people of Connecticut hear and read of little being done by their legislature. Then all at once the Connecticut General Assembly explodes into the headlines for a few days, with stories of important legislation being passed in the early hours of the morning after a continuous 10 or 12-hour session, bills being passed only by number or title, with just a few leaders aware of what they provide, numerous compromises on measures which had previously been stalemated for months, and important bills mysteriously disappearing, not to be found until after the session ended. Then the General Assembly adjourns, not to meet again for 19 months. Besides poor organization, the report found the absence of professional staffing a major problem. Robert Satter, now a judge, was a member of the legislature for 3 terms. He recalls,
"The legislature had no independent analysis of the budget. And likewise, on matters of substantive bills, we didn't know what they were about, and we really had no time for research. So we were making judgments based upon our own background and just making judgments off the top of our head in most cases, and deciding important matters sometimes."
The organizational faults of the legislature weakened it in relation to state agencies and the governor. David Ogle, who headed the Eagleton study, today is director of the Office of Legislative Management.
I think there was a widespread perception, certainly among the legislators of the state at the time, almost universal perception, that we had reached a point in which the executive branch of government dominated the legislative branch in the policymaking area.
The Eagleton report called for a far smaller legislature with a session every year instead of every 2 years, streamlined procedures, adequate pay, and professional staffing. To implement those recommendations, the General Assembly in 1969 tried to create a legislative management committee in charge of the General Assembly budget and professional staff. But the legislative modernizers didn't count on the opposition of those who would lose power if the legislature were strengthened, in particular Governor John Dempsey and powerful Democratic Party State Chairman John Bailey. Governor Dempsey recalls,
"Mr. Bailey and I felt very strongly against it. We both made up our mind that he felt too it was necessary, but I just didn't want to bring in more machinery. I felt the branches of government in Connecticut, the legislative and of course the executive, could manage very well without it. I couldn't see any need for it, so I vetoed it."
Governor Dempsey's veto backfired. David Ogle.
That veto was overridden by a unanimous vote in both chambers, and it was very rare at that time for a gubernatorial veto to be overridden. It was, as far as we could determine, unprecedented in the history of the state for a gubernatorial veto to be overridden by a unanimous vote. And when Governor Dempsey vetoed that bill, I think it brought Republicans and Democrats, senators and representatives, together in a united front in support of the legislature as an institution of government, as an independent branch of government.
Over the next few years, much of the modernizers' program was implemented. The size of the House of Representatives was cut by half. Annual sessions eliminated the 19-month legislative vacation. The number of permanent, full-time employees of the General Assembly increased from 12 to 176, while the number of patronage employees hired for each session was sharply reduced. Legislative salaries increased from $3,000 in 1972 to $13,000 in 1983. A follow-up study in 1981 recommended further reforms, but noted that the Eagleton Report brought Connecticut to the forefront of legislative change and improvement nationwide. Many states have since used Connecticut as a model in developing and improving their own capabilities. The General Assembly is one of the most effective in the nation. Advised by experts working on legislation much of each year, expected to devote much of their time to the job, the members of today's General Assembly hardly fit the classic image of the citizen legislator. Modernization has changed the amateur representative into a professional. Did the passing of the amateur citizen legislator make politics less democratic? Perhaps not. For one thing, the amateur legislator was no match for those he or she was supposed to oversee. According to one veteran of the General Assembly, the part-time legislature is placed in an impossible situation when it must confront governors, bureaucrats, and lobbyists who work full-time in their jobs. For another thing, an amateur legislature is by definition limited to those who have the time and resources to serve. The 1981 study of the Connecticut legislature concluded that, unless you are retired, well off, or have a flexible work schedule, or are in a special situation, you have no reasonable opportunity of serving the state. One legislative leader charged that, as a result, the institution is becoming a private preserve for the retired, the wealthy, and the unemployed housewife. Perhaps we see here one of the fundamental dilemmas of democracy. On the one hand, we want people in public office who are as similar as possible to those they represent, sharing the same values and ways of life, not a breed apart with distinct lifestyles and interests. Yet at the same time, we want representatives who are highly competent, professionals at dealing with the public's business. In this half of the 20th century, Connecticut has chosen to sacrifice the representativeness of the citizen legislator in pursuit of the competence of the professional legislator.